Ambreena Manji has been Professor of Land Law and Development at Cardiff University since the year 2014. Before that, she was seconded to Nairobi as the director of the British Academy's British Institute in Eastern Africa from 2010 to 2014. In 2023, she was appointed Cardiff University's Africa Dean. Her research is in African law and society. It is strongly interdisciplinary and includes work on law in African literature, African history, legal education, and women and the law. She has co-published with colleagues in history, political science, and development studies. She has written most widely on land law reform. Her most recent book is titled The Struggle for Land and Justice in Modern Kenya. Ambreena has been a visiting fellow at the Faculty of Law, University of Cape Town, and at Dar es Salaam Law School, a global teaching fellow at Melbourne Law School, and Dame Lillian Pension Fellow at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies, University of London. Ambreena served as president of the African Studies Association UK from 2018 to 2020. Between the year 2020 and 2025, she was co-editor of African Affairs, the top-ranked journal in African studies, and has been a member of the editorial board of social and legal studies for 2 decades. Ambreena sits on the council of the AHRC and on the British Academy's International Engagement Committee and its Higher Education Policy Development Group. She is a British Academy representative on the UK Academy's Human Rights Committee from 2023 to 2027. In reference to 2021, she was a member of the Area Studies Sub-Panel and is currently a member of the REF 2029 People, Culture and Environment Pilot Panel, UOA 20. She is a visiting professor at the Sutherland School of Law, University College, Dublin, from 2021 to 2026, and a member of the International Scientific Advisory Board of the Max Planck Institute for Legal History and Legal Theory that commenced from 2022 and continues to 2027. She was elected a Fellow of the Learned Society of Wales in 2020 and a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences and of the Royal Historical Society in 2020. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, let us give Professor Ambreena Manji a round of applause as well as we welcome her to deliver her speech. Thank you very much.
Hello, Professor, can you hear us?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. We just wait for your picture, but you can start.
Excellent. Thank you for confirming.
Thank you.
Of harnessing our sometimes quite rightly felt disappointment and sometimes despair, but also as a way of signaling to, particularly to our law students, the importance of hope, ideas and hopes that when the Constitution was drafted, and holding on to the memory of what was so optimistic and hopeful about the year 2010. And we should recall that whilst we ourselves as Kenyans are rightly self-critical and critical of those who deserve criticism, who have badly let down some of our hopes, we should, whilst holding on to that, also remember one of the primary achievements of this constitution has been to bring Kenya to the center of constitutional debates around the globe, so that it is now not possible to go to a conference on constitutionalism, constitutional law, and not have a significant number of papers on Kenya. so that Kenya is now recognized around the globe as a very significant jurisdiction to be discussed and debated and written about in relation to constitutional law. That in itself is a significant achievement that would lead us towards a fairer legal and institutional framework with which to govern land relations and land management. And we, all of us, can confirm that that has not yet been achieved. And I suppose what that might prompt us to do, what that realization that we have not achieved what we had hoped for in the land domain might ask us to reflect on, is whether we have perhaps put too much faith in law and legal processes, and whether in doing that we have obscured some of the bigger struggles that we faced. So my suggestion this morning is that law may have, in some regards, not been a tool of liberation, but quite the contrary, that law might have somehow obscured the struggles that we needed to launch. I think that by presenting law as a proposed solution to land problems, whether through constitutional provisions or more directly through land laws themselves, we may have blocked important deliberations amongst ourselves and amongst citizens about land like. The meaning and content of land reform has been reduced to a debate about land law reform. And I want to suggest that that has been partly strategic. It has been a way of obscuring bigger discussions that we should have had about what land reform really means. And so throughout my work, I've been interested in how law has dominated us, not just materially, but also at the level of ideas. And a lot of my work has been about the history of ideas and the history of ideas of law in particular in Kenya. Now, we all know that the term land reform has had a long history in Kenya. In its many different guises and through different eras, it's been deployed as an idea predominantly by those who can govern its meaning. So I want to suggest that we have had more insurgent notions of what land reform could mean, but we have never valorized those or studied them as deeply as we might have done. So that when insurgent notions of land reform have been asserted, they've been quite clearly extinguished. And what we've been left with is hegemonic notions of land that have valorized individual tenure, that have valorized the idea of private ownership, and where ideas of improvement of land have not lost their hold. And this has had important consequences for our ways of thinking. The substitution of land law reform for what should have been wider and deeper considerations of land reform have meant that we have avoided many difficult discussions. The intellectual history of land ideas in Kenya has yet to be written, and in particular, the intellectual history of insurgent ideas about land have not been written. And I want to assert, and I would be very happy to be challenged on this, but I want to assert that our overly institutional approach to change in the land arena has distracted us from broader discussions that we should have had, and which it is not too late to have, about what we mean by fairness, justice, and equity in relation to land. What, for example, do we mean by the equitable distribution of land? Now, we would not be alone in having this discussion. Those of us who have studied scholars of South African constitutional history will know that they have also been having and continue to have discussions about the ideological function of their new constitution. And I would cite here our colleague Joel Modiri, himself a distinguished professor of legal theory and of constitutions, who has written that not only does a new constitution, and here, of course, he's referring to the South African constitution, but I think this observation applies to us too in Kenya, not only does a new constitution purport to ground a transformed polity, and to define its values and ideals, it also hopes to hold together a fragile civic bond of nation. In so doing, the Constitution and the discourses and subjects it produces, Joel Modiri writes, must repress the difficult issue of the contested foundations and unrealized promises of the new order. It must monopolize the sphere of public and political engagement, unless actively countered by a different, more radical politics. And I think that observation, which I have been interested in since I wrote my book and published my book in 2020, rings more true for me now than it did even then. This idea that our constitutional discourses have monopolized political and public engagement and have stood in for or distracted us from more radical debates, including about politics and law, seems to me to be a very useful guide for the work that still lies ahead, the work that we haven't yet done, the work that still needs to be done. So my suggestion is that by joining land reform with constitutional reform, we have taken an enormous risk. We took an enormous risk. We put our faith in law. And in so doing, we blocked ourselves from debating or engaging with Kenya's long history of land wrongs and how best to address those. Now, of course, Kenya's land wrongs were central to debates about Chapter 5 of the Constitution, land and environment. Of course they were. They motivated many of its provisions. But I think we may have fallen into the trap of believing that the Constitution was the ultimate achievement, the end achievement in our recognition of those wrongs, rather than seeing the Constitution just as a starting point, putting into words some of our sense of what those wrongs were. What the Constitution may have prevented us from doing is digging deeper into the intellectual history of those wrongs and the intellectual history of some of the governing ideas on land, which still inform us today. Now, that's a radical claim to make in an audience of colleagues who will, of course, be deeply wedded and committed to the Constitution and its values. But I think that we would be right to think critically about law and to remember that Guy and McCausland, when they were writing their landmark study of constitutional law in 1970, recognized that law had a role in injustice. It had a role to play in the scramble for Africa. And it had a role to play in creating the deeply unequal structures of land that we subsequently have been trying to undo through law. In the domain of land, legal and other professionals have been concerned with developing and making effective a new architecture of land governance. Of course, that architecture deserves to be assessed, but what we must not neglect is the significant movement from the margins that should keep up considerable pressure on land issues. So we need to pay attention, in my view, to earlier, more radical movements, which in the immediate post-independence period challenged a conservative elite on land issues. Land scholarship in the future, if it's to have any impact or to have any intellectual meaning, must be understood as a key topic around which progressive struggles have been organized in the past and should be organized in the future. Land struggles have played a key part in wider political and constitutional struggles. They have been deeply integrated with what Atieno Odhiambo called African struggles for civil liberties, for human rights, for democratic participation, for workers' rights, for peasant independence, spiritual space, elective representation, and civic responsibility. But it's clear to me that these struggles cannot only be struggles about the content and working of law. This is not to suggest that law has no real role to play in discussions of land reform. Of course, debates need to take place about what legal mechanisms might be used to achieve the ends of land reform, which we've agreed upon. But the first prior step, I want to suggest, is that we need deliberative discussions amongst citizens of what is meant by land reform in the first place. Now, of course, we have had glimpses through our history of that debate. At independence, attempts were made by individuals such as Bildad Kagea to trace an alternative, more equitable vision of land ownership, just as in South Africa, the 1955 Freedom Charter asserted the land shall be shared amongst those who work it. The drafting of the National Land Policy was preceded by much debate, driven by civil society, seeking to draw attention to the dire state of land relations across the country and to propose solutions. And it was a significant achievement, of course it was, that we published a national land policy and that we inserted a land chapter in the Constitution. But what we, I think, need to remember is that we have had in Kenya a marginalized land movement about which we actually know much less than we should. And because we don't know about those past radical insurgent land movements, we have seen the elite succeed in containing and controlling the process of land law reform and turning enormous questions about equity and fairness into technical questions about governance and legal solutions. Now, we know, of course, that it is very difficult in today's context and in the context of 15 years ago. It is very difficult to have discussions about land reform, which are not reduced to questions about land law reform. So, for example, the wider international context does not favour us because in that international global context, it's very difficult to have discussions about land redistribution, for example. We have not, as a country, really grappled with what would be fairness in relation to land holding. We have not fully had a discussion, for example, about land ceilings, just to bring it to its technical manifestations. And that is partly because we haven't had an international context which is favorable to that. We have worked in an international context, a global context, and by this I mean an intellectual context, and a context informed by certain key ideas. We have worked in an intellectual context which is very strongly liberal legalist. So that the promise of strong institutions has been to the fore, and that has quieted more radical demands for redistribution, for restitution, or for reckoning with dispossession. We have instead embedded in our constitution and in our laws a private law model of land, where notions of the ideal neoliberal citizen have become powerfully apparent. So that land is seen as, represented as a tradable asset, one that can be leveraged to get loans, can be leveraged by the ideal productive citizen as an asset to be improved, to be traded. And what that has done is it has snuffed out other ideas about what land's meaning might be to our citizens. In passing chapter 5, in incorporating these important constitutional provisions, John Harbison makes the point that in relation to land tenure, that constitutional moment was really a moment in which we made comprehensive promises to ourselves about land, but also where we made potentially conflicting promises to ourselves about land. And what I want to urge us today is to think about what are the unarticulated hopes amongst us for particular political and economic choices. We haven't, as a country, even begun to confront the deeply perplexing choices before us. We have instead placed law and legal institutions very much at the center of our thinking. And we have excluded, and this is a difficult truth to acknowledge, we have excluded rather than encouraged contestation over economic and political choices. We have put too much faith in law as a substitute for contestation. Law, as Kennedy has reminded us, the rule of law can promise much. It can promise a domain of expertise. It can look like a program of action. But what that does is to obscure deeper distributional choices. Why have we chosen to distribute things? In my case, land. In my area of interest, land. Why have we chosen to distribute land one way rather than another? And we have lost touch with what the counter arguments might be, what counter reality we might have wished for. We have not, for example, truly had discussions about what a restitutionary future might look like. So, for example, we have not had discussions about what the prospects for land justice in Kenya are when we put historical questions of land justice in the past tense. What I mean by that is that if you look at the language of the historical land injustice regulations, they very clearly distinguish between historical and present land injustice. And that has, to some extent, prevented us from thinking about present land injustices. It has put land wrongs in the past. It has allowed us to treat land grabbing as irregular, as episodic, as exceptional, rather than to acknowledge that land wrongs underpin our economy as a whole. They cannot be sealed off from our present. They cannot be sealed off from our wider present economy. Land injustices underpin the very structure of our country. They have given impetus and energy to our current self-organization. And until we start to push back against an understanding of historical land injustices that makes them historical, we will not, in my view, start to make any progress in our understanding of the land domain. So we need to have conversations as law students and as law scholars about what might a restitutionary future look like. What would it mean to think hard about restitution in relation to land in the present day? And to have that difficult conversation, and I'll finish up my remarks by emphasizing this point. To have that conversation honestly and openly, I think we need to do more work to put our ear to the ground more conscientiously and to listen particularly to the sound, the very clear sound of a generational shift. Now, the Constitution is 15 years old, and what we are seeing, I think, is a very marked constitutional shift in Kenya, where young people are rightly asking difficult questions about what has this Constitution delivered for us. Not just in the land domain, but in the domains of civic participation, in the domains of fair work, in the domains of the cost of living. And that is a difficult conversation for some of us who see ourselves as an older generation to listen to. But we must do so with clear-sightedness. And we must take, I think, our guidance from young people who are asking difficult generational questions. And that generational shift, I want to end by suggesting, is absolutely critical if we are to prevent what I think is a danger of a constitutional or generational rift. And by that I mean that there's a real danger that a rift develops between the generations, where they talk past each other, where they do not understand the interests that they have in common, where they see themselves actually as conflicted and as having contradictory interests. We need to find a way in Katiba at 15 to think generationally and to provide our students with a way of expressing their generational aspirations, and to have some epistemic modesty as an older generation about the limits of what we might have achieved with the Constitution, and particularly to have that difficult discussion amongst ourselves as lawyers, because it's not in our intellectual training, it's not in our cultural self-understanding to be critical of law as a potential block on bigger discussions that we need to have. Our training as lawyers, our very training, has been to put our faith in law and in legal solutions. And I want to suggest that the time is right now to begin to say law is only one part of a bigger story that needs to be told about our intellectual history. And that intellectual history is rich with ideas way beyond law. And we can go to that intellectual history through all kinds of mechanisms beyond law, including by reading historians, by reading literature, by looking to literary scholars, for example, for their ideas about the sorts of claims of equity and justice and fairness we would want to assert. So to stand back from the law, which is not easy, and to say in what other domains might we start to find some suggestions about what a fair future and a restitutionary future might look like. And I think our role as legal scholars, as law teachers, and our duty to the next generation of young students of law is to say, beyond our own immediate discipline of law, what are the other disciplines of which we might call to make manifest to them some of these difficult questions we must continue to ask. And I'll leave it then. I'm very happy to invite comments, challenges, questions. Thank you so much again for the honor of being with you.